When you hear the words climate change, what comes to your mind? Perhaps you think of images of polar bears with sad faces sitting on melting ice caps or using reusable cloth bags at the grocery store. Maybe you think about your friend who told you to eat less meat and how they're thinking of not having kids because they fear for our planet. Or perhaps you think about the conversations you had with some folk who say that climate change is not real and how the youth of today are entitled, naive, and don't know what they are talking about. But whatever it is you're thinking, how do you feel about climate change? Do you feel sad? Perhaps anxious? Or maybe you feel numb to it all because it feels like nothing can be done and humanity is on a path to self-destruction. Nowadays, people are more able to make connections between anthropogenic activity and climate change. However, people are less able to make such connections between climate change and the toll it takes on their mental health. In today's world, youth are experiencing high rates of worry, fear, and anger with respect to climate change. Students from the University of British Columbia and climate change experts, Dr. Courtney Howard, Dr. Melissa Lem, and Ralika Radu, have come together to talk about the mental health impacts of climate change and what we can do to address them.
I'm Dr. Melissa Lem, and I'm a Vancouver family physician and president-elect of the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment. There are a number of different definitions for eco-anxiety, but the one I like is the one that says that it's essentially this feeling of impending doom because of changes that you see in your environment, specifically often due to climate change. And so the reason why I think we're seeing more and more of it lately is because the changes that climate change have caused recently are incontrovertible. We saw the heat dome this summer that killed hundreds of people. We saw the forest fires that ignited immediately afterwards, and also the flooding that caused significant damage throughout the Lower Mainland and cut us off from the rest of the country for a few weeks. So I think it's basically hard to ignore now. We can't just kind of have climate change happen in terms of just like the forest fires that are happening anymore. It's really happening through a lot of the year, and it's hard to ignore.
My name is Emily, and I'm a second-year student at UBC studying integrated environmental health. So for a large part of my life, I grew up in a really big city in China, and I remember there being a lot of air pollution where I lived. So basically, whenever you looked into the horizon, there was a lot of smog. On a winter day, there'd be so much haze in the sky, and you could barely see, like when I was living in an apartment, I could barely see the apartment next door. So when my family immigrated to Canada, I was so surprised and so shocked at how incredibly clear the skies were and how little smog there was on the horizons, and you could really see far away the mountains, the snow caps of the mountains. Recently, when there are forest fires in the summer and you see like fires coming in with smoke from interior BC or from California, and the skies would be hazy again, and it would just be kind of scary, and I'd feel a little bit anxious about it. When I think back to that and how much air pollution I was constantly being exposed to, it just shocks me how much one's environment can have, like how much impact one's environment can have on their health.
Do you know what's really interesting is early on in the pandemic, I expected a lot of my patients' mental health to decompensate because I thought, we have lockdowns, this new unknown with this virus that's infecting and killing hundreds, thousands, millions of people around the world. But I didn't really actually see those negative effects of the pandemic until actually the heat came, until the smoke came summer after summer. That was really when I saw my patients' mental health decompensate. And I think the reason for that was they weren't able to find refuge outside anymore. It was no longer safe to be inside or outside, and sort of that resilience and that the mental health benefits that spending time in nature really gave them before, they weren't able to access anymore. And then I think also just seeing the effects of climate change in the smoke and the heat on top of the trauma and the anxiety from COVID-19 just sort of put people over the edge. So climate change is really a risk amplifier. If you already have some issues to do with your mental health or other medical conditions, it just makes everything worse. So I think that's really in my practice and in my life when I really saw those effects of climate change hit home, of eco-anxiety hit home was when those climate events were happening.
My name is Dylan Ravanera, and I am a second year studying science at UBC. The media adds to my eco-anxiety by giving me access to limitless amounts of information, and that is scary. The media can instantly spread information lightning fast, and I can easily Google up what's happening in Vancouver Island to the Amazon about climate change. There is a lack of action that we are seeing, especially through media, and that is what's making me anxious.
The media has possibly contributed to people's sense of eco-anxiety because they're reporting on climate change more. So, I can't fault my colleagues in the media for focusing on it because it's here and we really want them to be telling the truth about the climate crisis. But I think something perhaps that the media could do a better job of, and which they're trying to do, is focus on solutions more, because if we're just hit with the doom and gloom of fires and flooding and heat all the time and we don't hear about how people are taking action on it, it's hard to be inspired. And so they are starting to report some of those stories lately, and I think it's almost just as important to focus on the problem and the solution in equal proportion.
My name is Raluca Radu, and I'm a registered nurse working in the School of Nursing as a lecturer at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, BC. Ecoparalysis is a condition that is associated with the environment whereby an individual starts to experience significant distress and where their defense mechanism kind of kick in, especially those of denial. So those lead to feelings of feeling paralyzed in relation to the impacts that are caused by climate change.
Hi, my name is Junwen Mogel, and I'm studying anthropology at UBC. I think people are a bit reluctant to act against climate change because they haven't seen results as far as we are concerned regarding what actions are taken by politicians or by nations. It's not an immediate result, so when you don't see what happens when you take action against it immediately, then you become a little unsure of what to do next.
I think the biggest problem that comes to becoming apathetic and paralyzed with respect to climate change is also if you start seeing that things around you are not changing, especially at the larger organizational level or maybe at the political level, and you're just starting to gain these feelings of, well, why should I keep trying if nothing around me is changing? So I think it's also associated with the mentality of, what if I'm doing this, or if my neighbor is doing this, then why should I, continue doing this or sacrificing my way of living or my lifestyle when I know that this cascade of events caused by climate change is still going to continue at the rate that it is going to continue at.
My name is Magali. I'm studying kinesiology at UBC. I absolutely find it difficult to manage my personal behaviors and the interest of the planet in sustainable actions. I struggle a lot with even the impacts of the way that I eat. I wonder, okay, if I'm gonna go vegan, does that even impact the future of the planet? For me personally, I feel anxiety or nervousness or at least discomfort or anger around the kind of selfishness that exists at institutional levels that lets human beings and other living things on this earth suffer. That causes me a kind of pain, and I know that a lot of people in my age bracket also feel this way, because we know that has been created in part by, well, the infrastructure has been created by the people that have come before us, and then we feel like we're left with this, mess, and then no way to fix it. So it kind of plays into this sense of this belief as a young person, as an educated person at a university, you have a responsibility to help this earth and help the living things on it and to prevent suffering. But then you're also faced with a society that benefits individual success and individual personal profit gain, or, whether that be any kind of gain, whether that be monetary or social. You're kind of faced with this weird mix of you need to do everything to help others, you need to do everything to protect yourself, and you need to make sure that you get ahead and that everybody else around you gets ahead. But how can you get ahead if the entire earth is going backwards and is, dying?
In the society where we live in, especially when we consider North American society, it's important to understand the values that are part of that society and how those values influence the decision making, both at the individual level and at the larger level, the macro level. And when we take into consideration the expansionist myth, there's this belief that with more growth economically, the society is going to be thriving and doing better. However, we really fail to consider what are the costs that are being paid by the environment through this accelerated ongoing growth and this ongoing hunger for people to keep up with the latest fashion, the latest devices, and so forth. So I think that it serves as a reminder that when we are in a state, for instance, of eco-paralysis, where we're really feeling numbed out to take any actions, I think that's really the time and place for people to ask themselves what's important to them and how they can align their way of living with a way that also allows the environment to thrive. Because we know that if our environments and our ecosystems are thriving, then human health is also thriving. So it puts into question the need for people to reevaluate the way that they're living and to bring us back to those values that we had in the first place before technology accelerated, the values of family, the value of spending time outdoors, of connecting with nature, the value of appreciating the beauty that surrounds us without being so absorbed by the devices that are really taking over our lifestyles.
My name is Zara Fazal. I'm studying global health and nutrition in my final year at the University of British Columbia. The tension between individual and societal responsibility is something that I really relate to, and it has really impacted me in terms of how much I can and will get involved with when it comes to the climate movement. And so at times, eco-paralysis for me means that I look at it as I'm working in a system where maybe the responsibility of the system and the priorities of the system aren't geared as much on climate justice because they're more pressing matters that are grabbing the attention of public health. And that becomes really difficult because then you feel like, no matter what I do, no matter how much advocacy I try to take part in, the system isn't built to really respond to climate issues at the moment. And that isn't to say that it is always a system's fault. For example, in Tanzania, which is the country I grew up in, there's so many other issues every single day that are claiming the lives of the people. So there is a bias towards other issues. And so for someone who works in public health, it becomes really hard to navigate the balance of all of this. But when I think of ecological paralysis, the one thing I try to do is understand that we sometimes fall in the trap of blaming the system or blaming the government, and that takes away and dilutes from the individual responsibility we have. And that is what is really dangerous. So when I try to think of it, even though I might be working in a system that isn't supportive, I try to think of it as what is something I can do every day to be grateful for how much Earth has sustained me so far, instead of thinking about the future that could cause anxiety for me.
Hi, I'm Dr. Courtney Howard. I'm an emergency physician here in Chief Drag East Territory, and I'm the past president of the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment. Ecological grief is grief at the loss of beloved landscape. Sometimes it has to do with actual experiences of trauma or impact associated with the changing environment. And increasingly, it's starting to be analyzed as a type of bereavement. So people should know that ecological grief is entirely normal and an increasingly felt response to ecological change. So I have personally experienced ecological grief mostly in association with a lake that I've been going to ever since I was little. So my dad grew up in Oliver, British Columbia, and my grandparents used to live across the lake from it's called Tuckalnuit Lake. And I remember going there twice a summer to visit my grandparents, swimming in the lake. And there was one wildfire there that I can remember the whole time I was little. Once when I was I remember maybe 8 or 9, and then another time when I was in my early 20s. We still go there with my daughters, and instead of that having happened, once or twice, I think we've only been there once maybe since my 8-year-old was born, when there wasn't quite a severe wildfire. So I find I get quite sad when I look out at this landscape, McIntyre Bluff, this gorgeous serene lake in August, and the air quality health index is usually, sometimes it's clear, but we almost never get through an entire week now without having at least a couple of days with an air quality health index maximum up at 10. And so I find that I have to spend some time and do some emotional work on those days to process the grief of the loss of that experience, of the skyline, of that wonderful sort of late July, early August feeling of peace and safety and contentment that we used to always have there.
I'm Lauren, and I just finished studying kinesiology at UBC. A personal example of eco-grief within my community is the changes within the natural environment, such as the forest that I used to walk around in. Prior to going to university, I used to spend a lot of time here to de-stress and relax. I was like, the nature really calms me down. However, now coming back from university, all this land has been changed into housing development, and it's really just sad to see. I think power is definitely relevant to one's mental health, just because when we feel like we have a lot of power, we perceive that we have a lot of control over the situation. And that's why it's so relevant when we bring up our ability to respond to the climate crisis, just because I feel like a lot of people don't believe that we have the ability and control to make a difference. But I think educators need to really promote that we do actually can make a difference within these micro scale actions such as composting.
It's really important to know that ecological grief is normal and that we're increasingly going to see it as more people experience impacts related to climate change and health. We also had quite a few wildfires here in Yellowknife's Dene territory, and people who've lived here for longer really felt quite a lot of grief in association with that. I find that, like any other type of grief, it's really important to allow yourself the space and the time to do the emotional work. It can be very easy to turn away from it, to just not want to feel those feelings. And I find that when I try to do that, it kind of saps my energy in ways that I don't quite understand. I find myself being irritable and having more trouble interacting or focusing or doing the work. And so give yourself the time. When my mom was diagnosed with cancer, it took time and energy to process that information. And people should maybe anticipate some similar types of energy input into the work of grief. I think, though, that what is really helpful to know is that when you've done that work, you feel quite a lot better coming out of it. You've realigned your expectations of the future and present with the future and present, and that tends to lead to a substantial decrease in the suffering associated with it. So you start to look at, for instance, the beautiful tree that you're standing next to by the lakeside that you've been going to since you were little, and enjoying that tree instead of maybe feeling real sadness at the smoky landscape out in front of you. And so I found that I have to be pretty generous and patient with myself in terms of the time I spend grieving and really bringing myself back to the joy that is still present in the present moment. You know, none of us are perfect biological specimens. We're all aging. We all have aspects of our bodies that are maybe creaky or a little bit painful, but every single one of us has still a lot of beauty and joy available to us as part of this little bit of nature that we walk around in every day, even in the midst of our imperfections. And increasingly, I look at the broader ecological system as being kind of similar. It's very much suffering changes. We know future changes are going to come, and we need to do everything we can to protect it from worsening impacts. But at the same time, there's still a lot of beauty, even in the midst of the altered landscape. So I would really encourage people to normalize the grief. We know that this is going to happen to many more people. You may be feeling lonely within it, but you will soon find other members of your community who are experiencing it. Do the work associated with it so that you can try to lessen the impacts of it for yourself, and then just really take a look at all the beauty that's still here. This part of the world is warming at triple the global rate. It's 2.5 degrees Celsius warmer than it was when an 80-year-old elder was born, but look at it. Still absolutely gorgeous. So lots of days are amazing. Much living entities and beings are still thriving, and there's still a lot to be grateful for here on planet Earth.
I think the notion of interconnectedness fits in with everything here, because climate change is such a wicked problem, and it's not something that science alone can solve. And it really requires our society to come together to solve this problem. We need everyone to come together to solve it. And I think our society is becoming increasingly fractured. People are feeling divided about issues, and the world is becoming more and more polarized. So we need to come together, and we need to realize that, you know, amidst all our differences, we all want to be healthy. We all want to be happy. We all want there to be tomorrow. So we should all come together and really embrace each other's support to conquer the problem.
I think a really important way to cope with eco-anxiety is spending more time outside. So when you feel connected to your natural surroundings, when you feel a sense of connection to place, not only can you see the beauty of it, but it also inspires you to want to protect it. And so, I mean, another thing that I think is important is spending time with other people who are working on this issue. It can feel really isolating when you feel like you can get into these kind of doom spirals of reading and thinking about climate change. But when you see, okay, here's what this community group is doing, here's what this national body of nurses or physicians is doing to fight climate change, that's when you can really find your power and sort of convert that anxiety into action.
In regard to what I want to do to help my mental health in the context of climate change, I'd like to continue to do some of the things that I do now. So I talk a lot with my friends who are studying forestry, who are studying different, maybe they're in healthcare, maybe they're in engineering, but we all kind of have this consciousness or this sense of responsibility to help the future. Talking with them really helps me kind of calm down, because I know that, you know, there are good people out there and they want to help just like I do. And they also feel helpless like I do. I also am really lucky and privileged to be able to go outside and to move my body and explore the outdoors, and to reap all the beautiful benefits that come from living in a city that is close to the mountains and the ocean. In my work, I'm also able to work with clients and take them outdoors. That really gives me a sense of hope, and that maybe fostering this kind of love, this appreciation for our natural environment, people will be more prone to protect it, whether that be for selfish reasons or collective reasons. In regards to what I want to do better, there's so many things that I can do better. My friends always laugh because they're saying, you're going to cut out fish, you're going to be vegetarian, and then I, have a bite of meat every now and then. But for me, it's about reducing that amount. And over my lifetime, I'd like to create a sustainable diet that helps me reduce the impact that I have on the environment. Whether that may be, we'll film this documentary in 40 years, maybe I will be vegan at that time, or who knows what will happen. But I'd like to kind of create this kind of like steady, sustainable incline where I'm more sustainable in my everyday life.
I see my place in the world in terms of mitigating climate change in two perspectives. One is the perspective of the work that I'm doing and the career that I've chosen, which is working in public health. And then the other is my identity as a first generation and low-income student. So in terms of my identity as the first person to go to university in my family, I see my role in climate change as I've had the opportunity to understand climate science. I've had the privilege to go through a higher education system that does talk about climate change. And so in my role, I see it as taking this information and sharing it with my community, sharing it with people from my family and from my neighborhood who haven't had a chance to get the same privilege that I have. And that is so important because it is the same communities in terms of my low-income neighborhood in Tanzania that is most affected by climate change. Whether that's when floodings happen, they're most likely to be impacted in terms of their housing and the structure of housing that they live in, or when it comes to things like food security and how climate change affects the food system. These are all situations in which low-income residents are the most impacted in terms of the effects of climate change, and yet we don't see enough of their voices represented in the climate movement. We don't see as much inclusion of these voices when it comes to the seats where policy change is happening as it relates to climate change. So in terms of my identity, I see it as being able to use the privilege in every step I get in terms of getting an education and working within public health to be able to change and impact the seats for those who are underrepresented and being able to have their voices amplified in the climate movement.
Helen Keller once said that although the world is full of suffering, it is also full of overcoming it. We are not separate from each other or the world at large. As we move forward in a world that seems like it is in disarray and chaos, perhaps we can overcome our eco-anxiety, eco-paralysis, and ecological grief by seeing how we are all in this together. In seeing our interconnectedness with one another and cultivating compassion, we can protect our planet.